So in this video, I'm going to be testing this tiny little 512 gigabyte USB-C SSD by TwoPan with the iPhone 17 Pro Max. Now this little tiny USB-C SSD is more than capable of recording H.264 and H.265. So what I will do in this video is to use it for recording 4K UHD H.265. And then what I will do, I'll come back at the end of the video, and during my summary I'll just give a few more little technical details about this particular setup. Okay, so I'm obviously outdoors then for this example. Now let me just explain a couple of things here. Because I'm using the internal microphones on the 17 Pro Max here, there's no wind protection, so it will get a little bit breezy. My dialogue might get wiped out a little bit. However, this is just to give us a really good example anyway of how this setup performs as far as the SSD is concerned. So once again, this is this little tiny nano SSD by TwoPan, and the way I've got the camera set up as far as like the recording is concerned, I'm using the Blackmagic Camera App. I'm using H.265 and I'm in 4K UHD. Now I'm at 60 FPS for this particular example, although I personally wouldn't normally record 60 FPS for these types of things. I'm just doing 60 just so that people know that you can push it to 60 using H.265 and 4K UHD. Now this bit rate is around 81 megabits per second, so this little tiny SSD will comfortably do that type of a bit rate on the recording side. However, and as I've already will have said during the introduction, you can't really use it for ProRes. I mean, you might get away with 24 out of it, but my recommendation for this particular SSD is for H.265 and H.264 recordings. So like I say, at 81 megabits per second, this will be the highest that you would get to doing 4K UHD at 60 FPS. Also, I'm using Apple Log here, and I'll be doing like just an auto transform using DaVinci Resolve in post as well with it. And I can't remember, I'll flash up on the screen which variation of log it is, because I think you can apply version 2 as well when you're in H.265. Anyway, as far as what it all looks like, looking at it from this phone here, as we can see, there's the back of the 17 Pro Max, and the SSD is absolutely tiny and it just doesn't get in the way of anything. Now let me just come round to this side here, get a bit of a closer look at what's going on. Let's just do a little refocus there, hopefully. Hold on. As we can see, it is super tiny, and that is just not adding any weight at all to the phone. And it's also quite flush as well with the side of the phone, so I wouldn't be worried about knocking that and maybe damaging the USB-C port. Again, it's a very tiny little SSD, and it just isn't going to get in the way. In fact, if you were putting your 17 Pro Max on something like a gimbal, a 3-axis electronic gimbal, then you're going to get away with using this SSD, because it just is not going to be adding any kind of appreciable weight which would otherwise unbalance a gimbal or something. So it's absolutely fantastic. Anyway, what I'm going to do now is just quickly do a little bit of a walkie thing as well with it, just so we can get an idea of walking around doing selfie vlogging. Okay, so just a bit of a handheld walkie vloggy thing is a bit more of an example of what's going on here. Now I can actually confirm some extra things now, because in between doing the locked off shot and then going to this handheld shot, I've just done some quick tests. Now I tested ProRes 422HQ, and you can't even record at 24 FPS with that, for longer than say 30 seconds. So definitely nothing, you definitely can't use 422HQ, because if you're only getting 30 seconds at 24 FPS, then everything else just isn't going to be achievable with that. Now I am going to hazard the guess that the reason why that is that although this is called an SSD, I suspect that what it is, it's an eMMC, which is basically like an SD card which, like a lot of phones, actually use those internally as well. It's not like there's anything wrong with them. They're great for certain things. However, when you need to push a lot of like sustained high bandwidths and stuff, they're not really designed for that. And of course, once you start using stuff like ProRes 422 HQ or even various other flavors of like ProRes, you definitely need something that's going to be able to handle like, you know, sustained high bit rates. And unfortunately, eMMCs are not designed to do that. So I suspect what's happening, the reason why I'll get about 30 seconds in like, you know, 24 FPS 422 HQ is because I suspect there's probably a little bit of like caching on the eMMC, and it's probably filling that up. And then when it comes to then, like, you know, writing that to the actual long-term storage, that's where the speed will just drop and it can't sustain the bit rate. However, I did put it down onto LT. I shot at 24 FPS and that went on for about a minute and a half. I didn't continue after that, but it did a minute and a half without, like, you know, failing or anything. So possibly if LT is of any use to you, you might be able to get away with that. However, as I've already said, I just wouldn't bother with anything other than H.264 and H.265 as far as this particular external storage is concerned. And to be perfectly honest, you know, H.265 is going to be fantastic for like probably 95 or 99% of the stuff you're going to shoot. I mean, it's highly unlikely that most people will see the difference between ProRes 422 HQ and H.265 by the time you've edited it and then recompressed it all and uploaded it to somewhere like YouTube. So it's not like you can't shoot a H.265, like, you know, and it can't look great, because it most certainly does. So like I say, that's my recommendation for this particular SSD. Oh, and also I am recording in log 2 as well, so I'm just hoping that DaVinci Resolve knows what it's doing as far as the auto transform is concerned, because I don't grade or do anything like that. So I basically just put my footage into a color managed workspace and then just like use auto transformer and stuff like that. Anyway, with all this blabbering on that I've just been doing, this is definitely going to give us a really good example of how this is all working in this handheld setup and stuff. And at like basically half a terabyte, running at say 81 megabits per second, because I'm at 60 FPS. And don't forget, that's going to drop right down on the bit rate when you start coming down to the likes of 30, 25 and 24 and such. You basically got, like, you know, tons and tons of recording time with this tiny little, you know, external storage device. And the cool thing about it is that when you get back in and you want to start editing, you literally can just plug this straight into the side of your computer, no matter what that computer is. It could be a Mac, could be a Windows machine, doesn't matter. And you got the super convenience of being able to edit directly off it. Whether or not you'll be able to do like multiple streams at the same time effectively, I'm not too sure. But for straight like single take or single cut timelines or single track timelines, definitely edit straight off the SSD. It'll be fantastic for that. And in fact, when I say it will be fantastic for that, it is fantastic for that, because I've already been doing stuff with it. Anyway, yeah, that'll definitely do it for this example. Okay, so to an end summary, and I just want to make a couple of things really clear. So during the video, I was saying that I do not recommend this tiny little external USB-C SSD for recording the likes of ProRes 422 HQ. Now, there is a caveat to that, and that is I use this phone for recording 4K UHD, and indeed if I use any camera system which is capable of recording 4K UHD, that would be the minimum resolution that I would record at. I most certainly wouldn't drop down to HD if the camera that I'm using can do 4K UHD. However, if you were to drop down to HD, then maybe your mileage may vary using this exact same little tiny USB-C SSD, because of course the bit rate drops right down as well. So at that point you might be able to get away with it. However, it is not something that I've tried, so I can't really comment any further on it. But nonetheless, I definitely would not recommend buying this little tiny USB-C SSD if you plan on recording ProRes 422 HQ up to and including 4K UHD at 60 FPS. However, this tiny little USB-C external SSD is absolutely fantastic for recording H.264 and H.265. So during this particular video, I was obviously recording in 4K UHD at 60 FPS using H.265. And as I mentioned during the video, that particular format and resolution and frame rate do require a bit rate in the region of 81 megabits per second. So this tiny little SSD is absolutely fantastic for that. Will it do 120 FPS H.265 4K UHD? I don't know. I've not tried it. So for me personally, I would use this for shooting mostly 25 FPS in 4K UHD. And if it'll do 60 all day long, it'll definitely do 25, 30 and 24 in UHD 4K. Now, another thing about this tiny little SSD is that it has a fingerprint scanner on it. So you can indeed lock the SSD with your fingerprint and stuff. It's not really for me, that type of thing, for this type of device. However, you can do it if you want to. Now, there will be a link to the SSD in the video description below, and from there you'll be able to find out how to lock it with your fingerprint and stuff if that's what you're into. However, there is one other thing to do with your fingerprint, and that is when you first insert the SSD, you do have to touch the fingerprint scanner part. Now, that is not to take your fingerprint, that's basically just to switch on the SSD. So you do have to kind of touch it as soon as you plug it in, but then after that point it is active. Anyways, that will do it for this video, and there will be links to everything used in the video description below. If you've liked the video, please do give it a thumbs up, and a sub to the channel would be absolutely awesome. I'm David Harry, thank you very much for watching this video. Take care and goodbye now.